Secure pod. Secure pod. Secure pod.
Secure pod.
In this episode, the guest is V.Jay LaRosa, cybersecurity leader with over 30 years experience spanning incident response at EMC, RSA, rebuilding programs in government, partnerships with DARPA, building security as a business enabler at TikTok, and now he's at Cisco Meraki. It's a pretty impressive curriculum. In the discussion, we strip back the noise around security culture. So what it really takes to earn trust, shift mindsets, and move beyond checkbox compliance. V.Jay walked me through the evolution of information sharing, practical challenges in supply chain trust, and the delicate balance of leveraging emerging tools like AI without losing human judgment. If you're responsible for making security strategic rather than tactical, this episode is a winner. So let's dive in. So welcome to the podcast, V.Jay. Very great to have you here. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Good to see you again, Nick.
You too. So I would have already done a brief about your background and the position that you currently occupy. But for the benefit of the users, I'll hand it over to you for a brief intro, a bit of a walk through how you got to be in the position that you are, and then we can jump into some of the topics that we want to explore today.
Yeah, that sounds great. It always makes me feel old when I tell people my background. I started way back in the day, actually 31 years. 1994 is when I started in a little company doing more electrical engineering work and computer work as an intern. And over time, kind of graduated into focusing more on networking and systems administration. And then, mid 2000s, worms, viruses, they were all the rage. And met this interesting individual, Marty Roche. Got involved with the Snort project a little bit and became a big open source intrusion detection aficionado. And then my career kind of really went headlong into cybersecurity at EMC and RSA, and I spent a lot of time chasing bad guys in the cyber incident response world. Then left from RSA, went to ADP and helped to rebuild their cybersecurity program and ended up building a lot of the fraud defenses and anti-money laundering defenses. Took a little detour in there at the same time and did some work with DARPA on some really cool projects and got to meet some really fun people in the memory analytics space. Left from there, took a little detour into private equity for a while and worked there as kind of the CISO for joining TikTok, where I spent a couple of years working to help with that journey and helping to build the cybersecurity program there. And most recently joined Cisco about 3 years ago here and started out in Meraki, which is the cloud network management platform that is just super successful. Now we're essentially the security organization that's responsible for all of the network management platforms for Cisco. So Catalyst Center, Spaces, Workflows, Meraki, and getting to do some really fun stuff across the business units and working with some of Cisco's other divisions and having honestly probably the best time of my career ever working in this program. It's really been a lot of fun. But 30 years of career summed up in about 3.5 minutes.
I think you did a sterling job there. Couldn't have summarized it better even if I had the script. The one thing that really struck out, and this is one of the reasons why I like discussing building security culture, which is the overarching theme of this podcast, with people who have been in the industry for quite some time, is how the perception was as a general statement through your eyes of security back in the days 30 years ago when you were sort of moving from electrical engineering and taking that shift into something that was more network system admin and then full on cybersecurity. How that's changed over the years. Of course, there's a huge development there. There are now degrees which are focusing on cybersecurity, which if even an add-on or an afterthought in some of the university degrees back in the day, I wonder whether there were internships for anything specific to cyber 20 odd years ago, 30 odd years ago. I'd hazard a guess really very rare, if not at all. So I guess, that would be a general question about the trends.
Yeah, I think back when I started, it just didn't exist. There was no formal programs, no college degrees. I think, SANS was probably the earliest thing I can even think of that's really starting to materialize some good educational capabilities. But at the college level, there was nothing, people were getting bachelor science, they were getting computer science degrees, but a lot of the folks that I was bumping into who were coming into the industry out of college were talking to me about learning about mainframe programming languages and COBOL. Nobody was learning, I should say nobody, but weren't a lot of people that were learning about C and C++ at the time. They were having to, find independent training on their own. It took a while. I think by the time 2000, 2003 hit, we were starting to see a lot more interest shaping up, and there were some very specialized programs starting to materialize at the time. in some colleges. And by the time I got to ADP, I definitely was seeing a huge shift in the educational system with a much, much, much bigger focus on, degrees in this space. But yeah, it's kind of interesting to look back and have seen that complete arc of going from, zero to some of the world's most sophisticated programs that exist. It's amazing.
Yeah, and a flood in the market of certifications, some which are fantastic and have a lot of grounding, but some which maybe less so, but there's definitely that understanding that it's needed. Two of the previous roles jumped out at me as well, and then can focus on the general question of building security culture as you've moved into those more senior positions in establishing teams, in TikTok and before. One was when you were working at EMC RSA and chasing bad guys. How did it look at the time, and how has that evolved as well?
Yeah, it's interesting because way back in the day, it was a much smaller network, a much smaller footprint. I think we had 3 internet gateways. Very easy for us to be able to track down where things were ingressing and egressing from. But at the time, we used to laugh. We called it 5 guys in a firewall. That's literally what it was. It was 5 of us in a firewall and packet sniffer. We were running around playing superhero, chasing down network impacting worms and cleaning up, SQL Slammer exploit, Code Red exploit. But really, I think when things took a turn was when EMC decided to acquire RSA. And I got to meet this, probably one of my favorite people in the industry, this guy, Art Coviello. And I laugh, I tell him all the time, I was able to trick him into giving me about $300,000 to build a cyber incident response program. And he laughs and he says, no, I was able to trick you because you were doing all this work for me that you didn't expect you're going to have to do. I convinced him to give me this money so I could build this NASA command center style environment where we would staff it with 24/7 incident responders and use all of the RSA technologies and show all the integrations that we had with all of our partners. And in return, I would agree that they could bring customers through this executive briefing center to come talk to me about how we were doing this. So I thought this was going to be, a once a month thing. It turned into 5 days a week, 7 hours a day, customers coming through talking to me. But in the end, I learned a tremendous amount. It was so great to have this bidirectional interaction with customers and talking about the problems that they were having, the problems that we were having, and really having this very open and honest dialogue and sharing. And this is back in 2006. This was kind of the impetus to us around information sharing. And at the time, everything was so quiet. Everything was so, don't tell anybody about what you're doing, how you're doing this, what types of tools you're using. You don't want the bad guys to know. No one was sharing any information. And it really was completely flipped on its head. And customers went crazy for this. And they were coming back 6 months later to do another tour to sit with us. They were setting up regular sessions with us to talk to us. We built this information sharing ecosystem with all of these customers, and it really was just fantastic for us. So you fast forward to today, and really that's just the norm. When you look at all the intel sharing platforms and the collaboration platforms that exist out there for people to be able to pass indicators back and forth, it's just the norm. That's how people expect to operate. When you take a silent approach and you become closed off, all of a sudden that's distrust and people think you're hiding things.
Yeah.
We're back 20 plus years ago. That's what people expected you to do from a cybersecurity standpoint. So it's an interesting transition over time, and to have lived through that, it's kind of cool.
Nice. The Not Secure Flag related, but a not-for-profit that I co-founded actually some years back was called the Good Faith Cybersecurity Researchers Coalition. And the goal was to advocate for enhanced legal protections for bona fide security researchers submitting to, identified vulnerabilities to companies and others. And it is a fascinating landscape that has matured a huge amount. And, in some entities, there is a necessary kind of equities process when things are identified and they need to evaluate whether this thing has a very high strategic value. But in the main, the bulk would be, yes, it's much better to actually shine light on it so that everyone can understand what can potentially impact them. But then I guess one of the questions or the perennial argument to that is how quick can you patch potentially? Because once something sees the time with which it takes attackers and some of the more skilled criminal operators to weaponize, a released X day is extremely minimal nowadays. It can hit the headlines and then within 24 hours you have identified impact in the wild. I think it's one of those conundrums where certainly I think the industry has chosen rightly that it needs to err on surfacing these issues, but there are of course caveats with that, and I guess that's life.
Yeah.
Interesting. The other question out of curiosity was the time in DARPA. The internet, there's a great podcast that one of the taglines that they have says, if you haven't created the internet, you're not pushing hard enough. Something along those lines. I'll get the right quote. I imagine that would be such a good place to work.
Yeah, and it was cool because it wasn't a job, it was more a partnership. So I still worked for ADP, but being able to partner with DARPA to create things that we both could use and to help, further some very interesting research that was being done. It was really, really fun. It was a lot of exciting times. Unfortunately, it's all top secret type stuff that you can't talk about, but to have been invited to participate and to be able to, work with some of those folks and to be able to bring some of those folks with me later in my career to some of the other things that we did was really, really valuable. And back before artificial intelligence was cool, I got to work on artificial intelligence. It was just really fun.
Nice. Well, I think that's a great recap. Security culture. So what is it? I guess we're all trying to figure that out. This podcast it's Secure Flag. So we have a training platform. We train developers how to write secure code. We also work on threat modeling automation as well. Something that always strikes our team, me personally, is there are numerous aspects to creating the mindset, and there's not just one lever that you can pull. So training is one aspect. It's very useful and important, and when applied well, fantastic. But when you're trying to build a security culture within an organization, taking into account not just, people in technical teams who can't rely on, say, a rigid or regimented, mandated type of, workflow that they need to adhere to, but across the organization, where do you begin? So what are the initial conversations? What are the first several months as the size of an organization as large as Cisco? Where do you start?
Yeah, I wish there was a magic secret potion that you could just unveil and use in every scenario, but it's different with every organization. In a lot of cases, there's previous culture that you have to overcome. I always hate when people say, oh, you can't change culture, because it's really not true. It's hard. It takes a long time to do that. But previous culture, overcoming that is the first thing that you really have to assess and understand. How do people think about security? Where is it placed in order of priorities? It also depends on the type of organization you're in. Are you delivering cloud services? Are you delivering on-premise software to customers? There's completely different mindsets and beliefs and practices in both of those respects. And in some cases, you're not delivering any software services. You're a bank, or I guess they are delivering things, but you're not delivering necessarily products to consumers that they're going to use to manage networks or to manage cloud or infrastructure from. Every organization has previous history with cybersecurity. Have they had incidents? They never had incidents. That kind of sets the stage for how you're going to approach what you're going to do and how you're going to build your strategy from. In some cases, you're fortunate enough to have sales organizations who are very engaged in what you're selling from a product perspective, because they want to sell into more markets. So market certifications really help you tremendously. So when you can partner with sales to put pressure on product management, who puts pressure on engineering to go deliver the ability to sell into various markets around the world, ISMAP, getting SOC 2s, getting ISOs, you name it. I think there's alphabet soup times 10 out of the various market certifications that exist. But that also plays significantly into the culture, because it can be a tremendous help to you in terms of getting resources, so that teams that are just oversubscribed, understaffed, can get some relief. But it also can create some challenges for you, because when people just hear you talk about compliance, they then start to disassociate security from it, and it just becomes checkboxes. And now, are we really doing anything to bring the level of security up? So you have to take all of that into consideration and figure out, how do you create a very balanced dynamic between all of that to be able to help start to change the culture in the organization. I'm going into my third year. It took me about 2.5 years to really kind of take what I had set out as the strategy, get it on the road, and get it working really well. And I think that's a pretty good amount of time in speed. It can be tough. You have to build relationships with folks. You have to build trust with folks. Those are the first and foremost two most important things. If you just show up every day railing them with fear, uncertainty, and doubt, that creates challenges for you as a leader. Now people don't really trust you because all you're doing is trying to scare them.
Yeah,
it can be different in every scenario. You really have to sit down and tear apart in your mind what your organization is, what it does. What are the enablers? What are the barriers? What are the disablers? What are the current beliefs? And then you have to think long and hard about how do you target the right people, the right opportunities to be able to introduce the right information. What is the right information? How do you demonstrate to people the things that you're discussing to them without making it seem like you're trying to scare them? Red teams are a great example of that. That's something that I've used extensively over the years. When you show up and you tell your boss and his staff about a problem, and they all look at you and say, that'll never happen. We've been doing this for 12 years. And then you put a video on the screen of one of your people actually doing it and demonstrating it. The silence in the room is deafening.
Yeah.
Right? And that changes people's mindsets. Now people know, wow, this really can happen. And then you ask the question, have any of you ever gone to look to see if this has actually happened? Right? Does anyone know how they would see if this has happened? And, that opens up new conversations. And when you're speaking from a tone of proof and validation, that immediately establishes credibility and trust. And you can really start to leverage that tremendously to make the changes that you need to make.
I think that was a wonderful response. I also really liked the part, I guess perhaps nowadays it would be more commonsensical, but where you're approaching departments like sales and you're positioning this as a net gain, it's an enabler for even sales. And then to extend that point, an organization like Cisco or, one of the other very large software, even hardware organizations would have their own security team, which also are then offering a managed security service as well. And so again, strong internal security is a sales enabler in itself because the organization is known as having that, and it has the gravitas to actually sell that as a service externally, whether that's coming from different P&Ls. It's kind of irrelevant. It's all part of the same package.
Yeah, I learned that a long time ago back at RSA. When we built that program and we were doing those executive briefings and we saw the impact on sales and what it was doing to help the sales organization close deals, that was eye-opening and very quickly became part of our go-forward strategy. If you look at my top-level OKRs from an organizational perspective, competitive differentiator. Right? What is security doing to help the business be a competitive differentiator? And we focus heavily. I have 4 OKRs. That's 25% of my strategy is how does security get positioned to help the company be better and sell more product and build more trust with the industry. It's not about direct revenue. A lot of times it's, revenue opportunity. The rest of the sales force has to go and close deals. But, being able to be part of that process and speak to customers and help build trust with customers, because let's face it, we buy from people we trust. That's a huge benefit to the business. So, from a CISO standpoint, I tell people all the time, yes, I'm a technical person, but my job is not to be a security person. My job is to be a business protection professional. So whether it is figuring out resiliency across the business and the products and the processes, or whether it's about helping to protect the sales cycles and the sales channels and the sales opportunities, or it's actually about making sure we're writing secure code and that we're investing heavily in tooling and technology and training. It has to be a very well-rounded approach for you to be successful these days as a CISO.
Yeah. Also, thinking about your mention of the well-known issue of having, say, an expectation of a particular standard and then that becoming a checkbox exercise so that once you have reached that standard, it's done.
Yeah.
And is that standard fit for purpose? And are the processes that govern that standard or those standards combined, are they sufficient? Something springs to mind recently in the headlines, a telemessage. I mean, this is a sort of blended question that I'm asking, but, telemessage was a government-approved tool. It would have gone through FIPS 142 for cryptographic modules and penetration testing, theoretically. NIST frameworks should have been adhered to. And throughout all of that evaluation process, there were some unfortunate glaring issues there. Now, That was a relatively, when you compare that with, say, Cisco and the coverage that Cisco has, that was a very small example. But you still have the certification standards and processes in place that have got through, in essence. That's a really difficult issue to resolve. So I guess here is the question. Apologies, it's slightly long-winded. But with regards to supply chain, how do you also view that? I guess that fits underneath your building trust kind of focus. But how do you do that from a practical standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, the supply chain is the most critical aspect of what you're doing in any general practice. And in the previous companies that I've worked for, some of the products that are being built, 92, 93% of the code comes from open source places, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're getting containers, you're getting Ruby packages, you're getting, Nginx, Node.js packages from other people. How do you trust those sources? There's a significant amount of work that has to go into building those tooling pipelines and ensuring that everything is coming through centralized, monitored places, and that you don't have these. Apple's a great example of kind of this in a high level. When you think about the Apple product, you can't load apps from other app stores, right? Everything's got to come through that central door. It's got to come through the Apple App Store, right? That model is, it's powerful. It's a control point that you can trust. And when you're building software and you're delivering every day, multiple times, new features, new releases into your infrastructure, you better have a good trusted pipeline that all the checks and balances are happening. You know where everything came from. You don't have people that are just slipping things past, the gate into the production environment. That's really ultra important. I think vetting vendors on the supplier side, when you're doing business with companies that are also going to be baked into your ecosystem, you've got to make sure that they have the right processes. And it's hard. How do you trust? How do you know that, yes, this person says they have SOC 2, this person says they have an ISO. How do you know that they didn't just answer the questions, that they didn't just ignore certain things? It's a real challenge. Unfortunately, there's no way that you can just prove it. You have to trust that the auditors have done their jobs and dug in, and that they were skilled enough to ask the right questions and follow the threads. But unfortunately, in life, to be successful, you have to take some risks. So what do you do? I always tell my team, to be successful in life, have a good plan B, right? So our plan A is we have a great supply chain program. Our plan B is we've got tons of monitoring. We have all the logging. We have EDR. We have anything even makes a funny creak in the infrastructure, we want to know. We want to be able to inspect it. We're lucky enough to own Splunk, the company, which makes life easier.
It does
to aggregate everything, but it's tough, man. I said earlier, people buy from people they trust. And when that trust is broken, you hope that people learn from their mistakes and that they fix their broken processes and they do better. I don't know that people always do.
I mean, yeah, and that's what I was kind of alluding to, that you may have a certification from some particular institution that organizes these certifications. What about their background? And then I've got in my mind an Escher painting, where you've got these multiple parts that just continue extrapolating. A guy who I've interacted with previously and we were talking about the philosophy behind, but also the practicality behind something that is considered as zero trust, because at the end of whatever pipeline you're following, whatever supply chain you're following, something somewhere has to be trusted.
Yeah.
Otherwise, nothing can be trusted, and therefore nothing works in that. And then that's a very simplified version of this discussion that we had, but it's tough. And you're right. There's really no answer to it apart from a ton of plan Bs and Cs.
Yeah. Back in the day, I used to tell the executives, if you want to be absolute most secure, never have any potential for a breach. And I would take out a pair of wire cutters and hold them up, and I would tell them, we'll just cut the internet connection.
There you go.
Today you can't even say that. You can't block radio waves, you can't block these cellular gateways.
Gone are the good old days.
Yeah, exactly. It's tough, man. Building trust and developing an outward facing corporate sense of you can trust us culture. It takes a lot of work. You have to spend a lot of time demonstrating, being open, being upfront, being transparent. And at some point, mistakes are going to happen. There's going to be an exploitable vulnerability. Your openness about what it was and how quickly you're able to fix it really demonstrates a core component of trust. I think that makes a big difference when you're able to, fix and remediate things quickly when you've announced them. I think that shows that you're staffed and able and capable,
Yeah.
right? If it takes you months to fix those problems, that worries me,
Yeah.
especially if you have multiple market access certifications claiming you have all these security capabilities, but you can't fix exploitable vulnerabilities in a reasonable amount of time. Those are the kinds of things that make me distrust.
No, I totally get it. And I guess it also speaks to the evolution of trust itself, because I think you inferred years back that really it was secret squirrel stuff, everything that was happening in terms of security. Now there's a level of the reputational strength. If you say, this happened, we resolved it with this, we released this transparently to stakeholders, to the media, to whatever the case may be. That builds trust. It doesn't reduce trust. Oh, that's a really interesting point. We at Secure Flags, we do training with typically technical teams on secure coding training, and something we focus on is the integration within, say, a workflow where someone is able to do any stuff ups in terms of, say, identifying and remediating a vulnerability in a particular type of coding scenario in a real environment, so that when they actually turn their hand to the actual environment, the live environment that they're working on, they are in a much better position where they won't be making the mistake. But then the triage, I guess, down the track, if they even still do make a mistake, is that it's directed back to ensure that they can run that again in a safe environment to remediate it correctly. So there is the focus on having someone as equipped as possible, but also the understanding that if there's a triage of a security ticket, then they can actually still practice that to ensure they get it correct. And that kind of iteration is how we've certainly looked at embedding security culture, at least in systems and processes. I really enjoyed how you described it from your vantage point in most senior role in security, I guess, in Cisco, where it's a lot more considered and business oriented. And I guess you're right. Your role is sort of I've forgotten the phrasing that you used, but yeah.
Business protection professional. Yeah.
I like that. I'll make sure to put that as one of the titles, AKA. But I think that, that really sums up your view and your vantage point as it has to be. Maybe not the right expression to use, but coming from your vantage point, seeing the business as a whole.
Yeah, I think it's very important. There's multiple levels, multiple layers of security. You have your corporate security and trust organizations. You have your business unit entities. Being business focused, aware of what the goals are, aware of what executive leadership wants to accomplish. From a CISO standpoint, you have to balance the quality benchmark and you have to balance the business protection aspects carefully.
Yeah.
Either one of those goes wrong and you fail.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, on that happy note, I think we're coming up on time, but V.Jay, it's been absolutely great having a conversation with you. Do you have any other comments that you want to share, or any articles that you're writing that you want to plug while you're here?
No articles, continue to just stay focused on how do we balance this AI tidal wave. And it's hard. You look at it, you want to take advantage of it and capitalize on it. But at the same time, how do you make sure that you're not over investing in something that is creating more problems, for you? I was out and about for my walk this morning. I was thinking about this, and, as we're investing in AI and it's helping us find problems, what do we do when the people who those problems are getting reported to have lost their technical acumen because they put so much faith in AI that now they don't really know what is being reported back to them? They're just trusting that AI is right.
Yep.
And it's funny because it only came up because I was doing something and I was looking at some output from this big process that we've created. It's doing some analytics, and it told me about something that's going to happen on Sunday, July 28th. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, I think July 28th is a Monday. And sure enough, I went and looked, and AI was wrong. It didn't know that Monday was July 28th. And it just, kind of stuck out in my head that, geez, if, AI doesn't even know the day of the week that this calendar day is occurring, how am I going to trust it to tell me about all of these problems and find, these things that we're expecting it to find? So I don't know, kind of lost in my head on that one today. It sent me for a topspin.
Yeah, I guess we're already seeing the impact of that, where you have discussions of people saying, okay, well, now the CEO is gung-ho of AI. Everyone use AI. They're not too clear about what they mean by let everyone use AI. And then you realize how much time it takes for the, moderate to senior skilled developer to actually comb through, has the code review skills to actually pick apart all the issues that were there. Whether that is resolved sooner rather than later, we'll see.
How long before those skilled people don't have those skills anymore because they don't use them every day?
Yeah.
Right? We all know you don't use it, you lose it. Right?
Yeah.
So a little concerning. But well, Nick, thank you so much, man. It was great chatting with you today. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, V.Jay. Have a wonderful day.
You too, buddy. We'll talk soon.
Bye.
Secure bus. Secure bus. Secure bus.
Secure pod.